Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast celebrating 10 years of broadcasting. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits.
Oh no, you're not!
Oh yes, I am.
Oh, all right then.
Well, that's a clue as to what we're going to be talking about today. Those of you with short tempers and long memories will probably remember that my very first episode of Musical Talk, very nearly 10 years ago, was about pantomime. And how fitting it is, therefore, that my very first episode, after we've celebrated our 10th anniversary and our 500th episode, should also be about pantomime. And it's something I absolutely adore. And in fact, it's probably the thing that got me into musical theatre in the first place. It's my earliest theatrical memory, and it's something that entranced me as a child and continues to entrance me as an adult. And that's because pantomime is a proper family entertainment. It's not just for children, although some people do think it is, quite wrongly. But for me, pantomime is something I'm always interested in going to see, and so this time of year is fantastic. This is the time of year when British pantomime is on, in the weeks leading up to Christmas and in the weeks after Christmas in January and even into February. Although historically it started on Boxing Day and usually ran through right up until the end of March. I go and see as many as I can, but one that I always make a point of seeing is the pantomime at the Greenwich Theatre every year, which has a story written by a marvellous man who really understands pantomime. His name is Andrew Pollard, and even better, he always appears as the pantomime dame. He's someone I've wanted to speak to for a very long time, and finally he and I were able to sit down and have a very good conversation, which touches on not only what he does in pantomime and his own very interesting career, but also touches on the wider world of variety, music hall, and the history of pantomime. And you'll hear that conversation over 2 weeks, this and next week. However, as I said, it was quite a wide-ranging conversation, and so I think it might be helpful just to give a very quick thumbnail sketch of the history of British pantomime over the last, say, 300 or so years. It's essentially a development of the Italian art form known as the comedy dell'arte, which in short dealt with a number of stereotypes, which could be broadly described as falling into the categories of lovers, and old men who get in their way, and servants who confuse everything. And it often involves a chase and quite a lot of pandemonium. And the characters were stock characters, so the lovers were Harlequin, the man, and Columbine, the woman. Pantaloon was the name of the old man character, and the servants were usually headed by Clown, and sometimes Piero, although much less so. And funnily enough, the Italian word for servants is zani, which of course is where we get the word zany, because in these pantomime productions, the clown and the Piero, the servants, are the zany characters who cause confusion, as you would expect a clown to do today. In Britain, the art form really solidified into the early form of British pantomime at the beginning of the 18th century. And if you went to various London theatres from about 1715, you'd get to see a pantomime using those stock characters. By this time it had generally boiled down to the 4 stock characters in British pantomime. That's Harlequin, Columbine, Pantaloon and Clown. And their antics were known as the harlequinade. You'll hear all these terms in our discussion coming up. And what used to happen is that the theatre producers would put on a sort of classical story of something from antiquity, but between the acts the characters in those pieces would transform by stage magic into the stock characters of the harlequinade and conduct their traditional antics of lovers separated by the idiocy of others until it finally all comes right, before those characters would transform back into the characters they'd been playing previously, and the original story would continue. That carried on merrily for the 18th century, but in the 19th century, the classical stories were more or less replaced by fairy stories, as we would understand a pantomime today, and the harlequinade would still take place in the middle, but that eventually became unfashionable and then disappeared from the process, leaving us with a phantom legacy of fairy stories with transformations and chases, and those stock characters still being detectable in the new stories which were coming up, Jack and the Beanstalk, Mother Goose, things like that. And that's how we've arrived at modern pantomime. I thought I'd just quickly explain that, because having a thumbnail sketch of that development will help you understand some of the comments in this conversation. I've never used the word harlequin more than in conversation with the wonderful Andrew Pollard. But now I'm eager for you to hear the first half of that conversation with Andrew on the wonderful subject of pantomime. Musical talk.
My name's Andrew Pollard. I play the Dame at Greenwich Theatre.
Andy, this for me is more of a pleasure than I think you can possibly know, because I have been enjoying the performances that you have given in pantomime here at the Greenwich Theatre for now 10 years, 11 this year, and counting. But I can genuinely say that I think you are the most interesting, the most funny, the best pantomime dame, the best pantomime writer in London at the moment, by some margin.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, that's a great compliment. I mean, some people might disagree with you, but I'll take that. I'll take that compliment. But thank you.
They'll be hearing from my solicitors, really nice. Of course. Serious question then. I mean, forgive me, it appears on stage where you're such a natural performer, you have so many sort of engagement skills, which in a way belies the discipline which I know hides behind a really good performance in anything, let alone pantomime.
Yeah.
How did you get into it? But I would like to explore that, the hidden depths and skills.
Sure.
Were you raised in a panto-going family? Is it in the blood?
Well, in a kind of roundabout way. My grandparents and my mum used to do amateur church pantos. I never really saw them because they kind of finished by the time I was a kid. But they used to do kind of little concerts still, the ladies at the Sunday school. So that was my first taste of theatre, actually, was the Sunday concerts. But they had loads of great photos of themselves in the 50s, black and white photos of them doing panto. I've still got them at home, and there's a great one of my granddad playing the giant. My granny actually played Dame one year.
Fantastic.
Bizarrely. Yeah, so there was something about those photos that really excited me. And then the kind of going to this Sunday school that had a little stage and going on there. So that was the very first little taste. I was never taken to professional theatre as a kid.
Really?
So I never saw a professional panto till I was a bit older. But I did see the amateur pantos. So there was an amateur company in Mosley, where I grew up in Northwest. So I went to see those, and that excited me as much as anything, So it wasn't until later on that I saw professional ones, actually.
Well, there's nothing wrong with amateur if it's done with gusto and some love. I mean, panto it's like every other form of art, it seems to me, that if it's done with love and appreciation and understanding, you can make it shine and it will pay you back. Whereas if you do it by formula or rote, then like any other form of theatre, it will die upon you, I think.
Yeah, and I think there were. I mean, I ended up working with some of the, because I joined the amateur company when I was a bit older, and so I worked with these people who I saw as kind of stars, in my eyes, who were very good at doing panto. There were a couple of people who, in my opinion, they could have gone professionally had they wanted to at some point, but they were very funny, and it was great working with them, and they just kind of had funny bones, and they knew it. So even that was quite a good training, actually. Yeah.
And you said it was a while before you saw your first professional pantomime.
Yeah.
Approximately how old were you, would you say? Do you remember what it was?
I'd probably say I was probably about 11, 10 or 11, actually. And Ashton-under-Lyne, which is the next town, they had a theatre. And the first one I saw was Freddie and the Dreamers.
Oh, gosh. I've seen them dance. But it was on Blue Peter clips.
You're right. Yeah, I mean, it was getting on a bit then. And there was a guy who he'd been old Mother Riley's understudy years ago.
Slightly younger Mother Riley.
Well, by this time, he was in his 60s, I presume, and he played old Mother Riley. So it was quite interesting to see. For me, I mean, I always loved, I don't know why, but I always loved music hall. I always loved old films, Crazy Gang films, old Mother Riley films when they were on when I was a kid. Will Hay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Talking my language.
Yeah, all those, I absolutely adored all those. So, then seeing somebody who, one, had worked with this, with one of those kind of big music hall stars, but was doing that act, and even then, it's really weird at kind of 11, I find that really... I just had a love of all that, so it was really interesting to see.
I do understand that, though. I mean, I don't travel in exalted circles such as yourself, because I'm merely a parasite on creativity, as you know, by watching. But I got into theatre, which has been a lifelong love, through pantomime. And I've always looked back towards the theatre. It's been my great delight that they've recently been repeating the good old days. I know it's a kind of sham musical. I appreciate it's all genre and all times in one, but you certainly get to see the quality. And, occasionally, and I'm sure we'll be talking about Arthur Askey again, but Arthur Askey does roll out every now and then, and you think, that you just half the fun is watching his act. The other half of the fun is watching him play the audience.
Yeah.
And he just knows how to do it. He just gives them a smile.
Yeah.
You know, a catchphrase in his case, "Hello, playmates," or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And they love him. And he can do anything with them. They are putty in his hand.
Absolutely. But actually, that the good old days. I mean, I grew up in the 70s and watched it, and even on that, you know, you still got people who had been doing variety, you know, so you still got a taste of that real thing. And of course things like people like Ken Dodd who,
of course,
you know, carry that tradition on. So and Les Dawson and people like that. So it's still great to see.
You could see the people doing the thing that they did in every theatre they did it in. There's the amazing man with the flowers out of the box. I don't know if you know him. Yes. And there's a fellow who used to, forgive me, this is a musical theatre thing and I'm sure you're aware of it, but there was a chap on who did Sir Richard's Gone Hunting, I think it's called, which is a kind of...
The Foxes in His Lair.
The Foxes in
Denny
His Lair.
Willis.
Denny Willis. And
I have to say, I mean, there's been occasions where I've thought about nicking that, or maybe getting in touch with his family if they're still there, because that was used to be one of my favourites. Absolutely great physical comedy. And even, I mean, when I saw it on the good old days, he must have been quite old then. He looked, you know, I mean, I know he's playing a slightly older character, but I think he was getting on a bit. You know?
Well, there's lots of YouTube clips of him doing the same act on a lot of German television when they show variety, and you can see him getting through different ages and different clothing.
Yeah.
But, well, you say borrowing his act, but the act is borrowed. Because if you go back further to the 1930s, believe it or not, Jack Buchanan introduced that in the 1930s in a show.
I didn't know that.
And they filmed some of the sketches of that show.
Right.
And it's slightly more rudimentary. I mean, Denny Dennis really polished it up and made it as funny as it was.
Yeah.
But there's the urbane Jack Buchanan hamming it up, I must say, doing the Foxes in His Lair with three other sort of gentleman singers exactly as Denny Dennis does it. So, and I think it's from you have to be careful how you say this, the Charlotte Review.
Oh,
it's
right.
Charlotte with one T, which I'm sure caused the girls in that particular dance group a great deal of trouble on the circuit.
Yes. But
please do, with my blessing, do that. I'd love to see that.
Well, maybe at some point we will, but it's you know, that really stuck with me. And I mean, obviously you're doing the same, but YouTube has been great now of finding these things again, and you know, you keep them in your favourites and store them up. So yeah, I do a lot of that.
And in a way, it's almost important that they don't die.
Well, I think so too. You know, and Panto is part of that. I think. I suppose on the whole, I kind of feel that the pantos we do nowadays are really a kind of hark back to music hall. That you know, it is that kind of panto we do. You know, obviously it changes and gets souped up, and those kind of routines always work. You know, they just do work if you get it right and you've got the right people doing it. So yeah, and I think it's part of that thing of keeping those things alive. You know, if you can.
There's an odd oral tradition in pantomime. It's proper traditional pantomime as well, isn't there? You know, the blank pages in the old scripts that says the tiddly tree here or something like that.
Yeah,
and you have to know what the tiddly tree is to carry it on.
Yeah.
Whereas if I said that to almost anyone in the street, have you ever seen the tiddly tree? I'm sure I get a punch for it. A punch up the bracket.
But yeah, as Hancock might say, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's now a book you can buy this guy has put all those routines in.
Really?
Yeah, which is actually quite useful, you know, and it's great that they're finally written down. But he says in the foreword to the book that, you know, he first started panto and you'd get there and the three main comedians would go, right, well, I'm doing my special, you know, we'll do the tiddly tree there, then we'll do the ghost gag here, and so they'd work
Who's
out
going to paper the parlour?
Yeah. And then he said that sometimes they'd sit around scratching their heads trying to remember some of the bits of it, you know. And this guy so very diligently has put them all in a book, which is really good.
Well, I'm really pleased because, as I say, there is a danger that as those theatre traditions die for vaudeville and music hall, they still exist, but they are now so sporadic.
Yeah.
That someone has written them down, like all the great folk music from 200 years ago. If someone hadn't recorded that in written form, we'd have none of it left.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, sometimes I collect books on panto and variety and all that, you know, and I'm just a bit of a nut about it. And there are certain tantalising titles of acts. There was a thing called I've heard about it twice, called the Phantom Regiment.
Ooh.
And it's something about, I don't know how they did it, but you had a sort of marching band. And it must have been a series of gauzes or something that they slowly appear through these gauzes and some kind of ethereal music they're playing, and then the gauzes come back again and they disappear. But I can't quite see what the act was or how it would work. But you know, those kind of weird things and things like one of the kind of professional ones I saw early on had the dancing fountains, which they don't get done very often now.
I saw one when I was 10,
Right.
which would have been 1980. And I remember it now because at the time, I must say, I was bored rigid because I was 10. But
Right.
now I look back and I think I saw the dancing fountains because that is an almost dead tradition, is it not?
Yeah, no, it is. And actually, a couple of years ago here, we looked into doing it. But because we use a Revolve here, because there's no storage backstage, it was just impossible to do. And there is a company, I mean,
You could drown the orchestra as well.
Yeah.
It's a deep pit here, isn't it?
But technically, all that's sort of souped up now, and they do a lot of like big pop concerts, and that they can do a thing now where it can rain words, which I saw actually at up in Bradford Alhambra. One of their pantos about 3 years ago,
and they had that.
And they had that, yeah, and it was kind of this waterfall was telling them where the baddie was or something, and it was great. It was really good, and there's that certain weird smell of that water that's been stored that kind of wafts. It's just really evocative.
Out of the tank, back into the tank. Out of the tank, back into the tank.
Exactly, yeah. And actually, I mean, I usually go to see the circus at Blackpool Tower every year. They still do a traditional circus all the way through, and they've got, I don't know whether you know this, but the circus ring at Blackpool can flood in 2 minutes, I think. So the bottom sinks, it's got these little fish heads all round, water pours out, it can fill up, they have dancing fountains and they have things going on, and that's always the end of the panto. So it's still, and the smell of that, again, is just brilliant, it's that really evocative thing. So, yeah, so something that's still just there.
I now want to go to Blackpool.
You should.
You've literally whetted my appetite.
Well, listen, I'll tell you, I would recommend going to that circus to anybody. It's the most amazing building, because it was Frank Matcham designed the circus, and the ring is inside the 4 bottom struts of the tower.
Is it somewhere near the aquarium or above the aquarium?
Well, the aquarium's not there anymore.
Is it not?
No. The aquarium's,
shows when I last went.
Yeah, the aquarium's gone. So it's below. It's the bottom. It's the very bottom. So you go down into it. So it is the bottom of the tower.
But if it's a Matcham, then it's a proper theatre space, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's just gorgeous, and ornate, and they still have a live band. It's just great. They don't have animals anymore, obviously,
no.
thank goodness. But yeah, it is amazing. I'd recommend it. Yeah.
It sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
I mean, I've only been to the Blackpool Tower once, and just walking and exploring just the corridors was wonderful.
Yeah.
And of course, they do have, or they had certainly, sort of a dedicated museum to Grimaldi. Of course, the great clown of the Italian style panto.
Yeah, and and there's the tradition as well. You've still got your circus clowns, which exactly. Grimaldi, their routines. I mean, the one I saw this year, this clowns did the Busy Bee routine, which gets done.
Ascii?
Which gets the Busy Bee. What have you got in the hive for me?
Oh, right.
The Spit the Honey, which is a panto routine, but he obviously was older than that, and it's probably in circus, and and those traditions are, you can see the lineage of all that.
I'm afraid I didn't realise. I always have Arthur Ascii running around my head. So
you're obviously a big fan of Arthur Ascii.
Who is? Well, I'm a bigger fan than Arthur Ascii was himself, as
right?
It were. Yes. I think Arthur Ascii's fantastic.
Yeah, I know. I know some people who really don't like him at all. Yeah.
But his is such. I mean, even if you don't like his act, he's such an important career of the 20th century. He did all that free stuff on the early days of television.
Yeah.
Famously for no money. He inherited Will Hayes, 2 colleagues from the Gainsborough films.
Yes, that's right.
Marriott and
the
Graham.
Edgar, is it? Oh, Graham Moffat, was it?
Graham Moffat.
Yeah.
Thank you. You're very good.
Yeah.
Things like that. He was working all the way up until his legs were amputated, as you know.
Yeah. I think sometimes with him, it's because he was one of those people, wasn't he, that he was just a funny man, and you couldn't, apart from the songs, you couldn't necessarily pin a routine on him or anything. He was just very good at chatting and doing all that. So
on Bandwagon, he outwits, as it were, Stinker Murdoch.
Yeah.
On the few recordings I've heard.
Yeah.
Not being there, of course.
But but a lot of comedians are Marmite, aren't they? I mean, and you can sometimes grow out of them. I mean, George Formby, I used to love as a kid. I don't quite like so much now, and it's just that.
It's funny, I've worked the other way around. I don't like the film so much, but I like the songs very much better.
Right, yeah. Well, the songs are good, actually, yeah.
And there's always a new one, by which you can always find new ones.
Yeah.
This is by the by, but I hope you don't mind a little meander. They have recently discovered, not a complete collection, but a large selection of the recordings he made for Radio Luxembourg in the 1930s.
Oh, wow.
So like everyone else, they would record for the English Radio Luxembourg and Radio Normandy series that were broadcast at the time, commercial radio in the 1930s, outrageous. They would record them in London and then take the records all out,
Right.
and then they'd be played back to Britain. But sadly, you may or may not know this, there's almost nothing left of the old pre-war Radio Normandy archive because the studios were in France. And then when the Germans came in 1939, 1940, they were all lost. So very, very few of these records survive, and they've just discovered an entire selection of George Formby recordings from the 1933 radio programme. So even now, there are new Formby songs coming out if you want them.
It's incredible. It's great, though. It's funny, isn't it, that things, still there are things to be found.
Yes.
Which is great.
But back to you and your career. So we've got to your love of pantomime through your family and your youth, and then seeing it professionally. But I believe you were a street performer first, in the broadest sense, before you sort of became, and I use the words very advisedly here, with speech marks the size of Europe, professional.
Yeah, I mean,
how did you make that transition from love of pantomime into performing?
Okay, well, I mean, I take issue with the professional because the street theatre. I'll go on to talk about the street theatre, but I learned a great deal, and there was a real structure, and actually the people involved, they loved music hall as well, and that kind of performance. So I'll go on to talk about that.
But I don't mean that pejoratively.
I know.
You're right to make the point.
No, I know what you mean. Yeah, so I did eventually I went off to do a drama degree. And funnily enough, while I was doing my degree, this was in a place called Old Sager in sort of just outside of Cheshire, sort of Stoke area. And it was a very kind of isolated little campus, very odd. It was arts and sports science mixed people.
Not an obvious marriage.
No, and sometimes it caused friction. It was quite interesting. But we were isolated, and so we were encouraged to kind of do our own work, really, and we just, we didn't go very many places to go and see stuff. And me and another guy I sort of became friends with, we had a love of music hall and all that kind of stuff, and we started to do a kind of double act together for a while. And we did it at college, and it went very well. And then we did some gigs, but in the end, we both didn't like it because we weren't very suited to stand up. We found it very scary, and it was more kind of review. We were very comfortable in a little theatre, but not in stand up. And in the end, we didn't do it. But while we were there, we did do a couple of very sort of small pantos. We got friendly with this guy who ran the leisure centre in this town, and they'd had a little touring bad sort of panto, and we said, well, I think we can do better. And we did it for 2 years, and so that was really nice. So that was a little intro into writing them, because I wrote them. And then, I got into this street theatre company. A group of us moved to Manchester after our degree, and we were affiliated to a little theatre called the Green Room, which is in the arches of the train station.
So what do they call their hospitality suite?
Yeah, it was just one big green. Actually, it was pretty rough and ready. Yeah, but again, I persuaded them to try doing a Christmas show, and we did one. A group of us did it for about 4 years, and they were like little potted pantos. So I was trying things out and doing that even then. Although I wasn't doing dame, I didn't do any kind of dame things, but comedy characters. And then I joined this street theatre company. I'd seen them when I was doing my degree. I don't remember there were 2 garden festivals in the 80s that Thatcher had. She was trying to revive depressed areas. Stoke was one and Liverpool was another. And they built these sort of theme park garden places, and it ran for a year in each place. And so there was...
almost like a pleasure garden.
Yeah, exactly.
Pre-musical option.
Yeah, exactly what they were, actually. Yeah, they were like a pleasure garden. And so there'd be entertainment, and there'd be street, walking entertainment.
Stoke Tivoli.
There's a concept. But they... I saw this street theatre stuff, and I really liked it. And eventually I wrote to them, and they got me down there. So they were a curious mix, because they'd originated in Bath, and they were all art students, and they were slightly sort of hippies in the late 60s and into the 70s. But so they had a kind of art aesthetic, but they loved music hall and comedy, and the comedy was really strong in the street theatre. So what we'd do is often it was very British archetypes, and we'd do kind of surprising things, so unlikely things that these people might do. So we used to do a thing where we'd have kind of bowler-hatted businessmen, very kind of serious, the black suits, and we had suit.
I know the motif.
Yeah, yes. And we'd had these suitcases, these briefcases made specially that filled with water, and there was just a little hole at the back, and so they'd just slowly be dribbling water so you'd get people trying to get your attention, and so they'd follow you a little bit, and then you might stop and talk to somebody and deliberately wet their leg, which the other people had seen, and so that was a cumulative effect. And we'd do policemen, we used to do kissing policemen, male and female, walking along, and they'd start snogging or feeding each other ice cream. So it was kind of archetypes doing unusual things. But the kind of the aesthetic, and unlike a lot of street theatre companies, we were so neat. It was all about precision. So we used to get derided by other street companies because we always took ironing boards and irons, and it was about how neat we were and how our costumes were so neat. And that kind of comedy timing. Most of the people in there loved the same kind of things, and we loved dressing up, and we'd go and source costumes from charity shops and things. So that was a really good training, actually. And one of the good things is that it wasn't a show. So we were peripatetic, so we'd wander around, but there was no script, and so you learnt to improvise, and you learned who wanted to play with you and who didn't, and so you could move on if they didn't want to play.
So you can read an audience in that.
So you start to read an audience. So actually, it was a really good training, really, really good. And while that happened, again, I would do like panto, and I saw an advert in the stage. I mean, it's like nobody gets a job from the stage anymore, but it was this company who were sort of like number 2 sort of standard pantos, and they were looking for ugly sisters. And I went and auditioned, and I got an ugly sister, and so that's how I got into kind of professional panto.
As an ugly sister, which isn't, I always think. Yeah. Well, I'm sure we'll talk Cinderella as well, because I always think that's one of the odd ones for dames for obvious reasons. Mm-hmm. But I've got to ask. I mean, you're talking about a company. I suspect you're talking about the kind of things that's quite prevalent, and they have their place absolutely. But the franchising of pantomimes, slightly, where I go and see a lot of pantomimes because I adore pantomime, but there are certain ones, if I know they're produced by a particular company, I know that I will have seen a variant on that Cinderella before, or a variant on that Jack and the Beanstalk before. Yeah. And the template script goes round, and then I believe that people add, quite often the dame actually, I believe, writes and adds scripts, jokes to it, and then it, not necessarily performed by themselves, but that then gets sent on to the Cinderella that's being performed somewhere else on the circuit of theatres that are working that franchise. Yeah. And that's a very cost-effective way of doing it. And also it brings pantomime to a lot of people. It sadly, I think, plays slightly to the idea that pantomime is a children's show rather than a family show, because it suggests there's a generation comes through, watches the pantomimes and goes away again, so won't remember that the Cinderella they're seeing is extremely similar to the Cinderella they might have seen 10 years before. Yeah. Whereas there's also a huge tradition, I'm personally sad to say more in the north than the south, as someone who lives in the south, of homegrown repertory company kind of pantomime. A particular theatre will have a dame who's there for 40 years, or maybe not 40, but maybe even. Well, and then it gets its own reputation, and then they produce some of the richest, best, most wonderful pantomimes. So I don't in any way knock the franchise version, and it's an excellent way, as you say, of grounding yourself and learning some of the tricks of trade, I suppose. But I will be very sad if all pantomimes were like that, and it's therefore, if you do a good pantomime that's of an independent mind, it's easy also to improve upon it. So that's only my view. Yeah, but I think interestingly, I think panto was probably kept alive because of that touring element of pantos going from one place to another, and swapping them round. But actually, when that was at its peak, I suppose, in the maybe sort of 20s, 30s, 40s, there was still a kind of pride in it, and they had people in it who knew what they were doing, and that their routines and they still had that tradition that was very strong. So, I think I'm with you really. I think it's horses for courses, and there are different types. And if you want to go and see a particular star, then that's the panto you go to. And yes, obviously, often they've done that panto 3 or 4 times somewhere else, and they just change some of the references, and there you go. It's when the Shetland pony comes on just before the end of Act 1. I know. I've seen that one before.
Yeah, but I mean, even there's something in that still. I think because I think one of the reasons Panto's still here is we still like being told those stories, and so the familiarity sometimes I think is as important as anything else. Yeah, I mean, I don't mind so much seeing the pony, and you kind of think, yeah, it's kind of there is a kind of slight nostalgia to it, isn't there?
Also, and I would be churlish if I didn't say it really works, because the moment it comes on, certainly, mostly with little girls, but actually everyone goes, oh, yeah. And you hear the entire audience doing it.
Yeah, yeah.
A friend of mine told me a fantastic story, though, about Richmond Theatre, where they were doing one of these
right.
a few years ago, and he's a musician in the pit. This chap, and they have an extremely strong rake on the stage. You can see where this is going.
Yes, I think, where it was going. Yeah.
Yes, quite. I think you might be ahead of me, my lord. Yeah. So the horse relieved itself, and all the pit were just looking up as it's inexorably made its way down. Presumably the tuba player made sure he was on the other side of the pit for that moment. But
yeah, but I love those kind of stories. It's kind of all part of the tradition as well, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, so for me that. Doing that, I think I did 5 years as Ugly Sister, 4 or 5 years, I can't quite remember now. And it was a great training. I mean, except that I hoped that I would go into it and learn from the old pros. But that kind of wasn't the case, because it was about the time of the gladiators and things like that. So
80s, 90s.
Yeah, so I ended up doing pantos with those people who were lovely and great, but had no idea of the traditions. So I had more of an idea than the names,
And there is that period, isn't there? I think of it as the late 80s, when suddenly celebrity became the big thing in pantomime. And as you say, that was fine and still is, if you like that kind of thing. But it does feel like the end of the old tradition and the new tradition taking the trappings of pantomime without necessarily understanding the tradition. I don't want to get too poncy about this.
No, but I think you're right. But I think again, that's the transition of the absolute dying of variety, wasn't it? I mean, still in the 70s, you'd still have summer shows, summer seasons,
and on the television variety programmes, which you didn't for 20, 30 years.
For some reason, I don't know, the kind of economics, something that slowly died out, didn't it? And so. Yeah, so those performers disappeared, and there was no tradition of keeping those going, and so then the celebrities came in who were TV names. I mean, there have always been odd celebrities in panto. I'm reading books of Victorian pantos that have boxers in it, or great sportsmen. So there have always been people a bit like the Frank Brunos who weren't theatre people. There's always been that tradition, I think. But
Frank Bruno is the one people always remember.
Well, yeah, I think because he was very, like you say, I mean, he was one of the big names, wasn't he, of that period, that wasn't an actor that suddenly, became a personality.
Indeed, yes. Yeah. Possibly the first of his type in a way.
Yeah, yeah. There was an element of training with those pantos, but there was also, it was a good, bad year I had. So I think I did 4 years of Ugly, and then they said, would I do Dame? And I did it, and I wasn't very good, and I didn't enjoy it. One of the reasons was that I was paired with a stand-up comedian from the clubs who just didn't want to play, and he had an act, and he was a one-man band, so he would constantly come out of a scene to stand at the front and do 10 gags, and I didn't know how to compete with that, and I just felt I hated it, absolutely loathed it.
But that's also non-collaborative, so it's certainly not in the spirit of a good panto.
No, I think not. I mean, I don't want to do him down. He was very funny, but that was what he did, and I didn't have the wherewithal to kind of cope with that, or to try and sort of turn it so we could do it together. So it was it wasn't entirely happy, but it made me start to think about what the kind of shows, the pantos I'd like to do, and I stopped doing the commercial pantos from then on. And that sort of coincided as well with me going to drama school. So I went to drama school when I was 30.
Which, and I hope you won't mind me saying, could only be 2 or 3 years ago. But
and the rest.
But your career seems to be one constant stage of development and learning, and that's a marvellous thing, it seems to me. That you're also, the way you're describing yourself, you're, even when the experience isn't good, you sit there and analyse what's happening, and then you take the next step in your career, and you take the next step about thinking what might happen.
Yeah, I mean,
Not everyone does that.
No, maybe they don't. I don't think it's necessarily at the time I kind of thought about it in those terms. I don't think you do you?
No.
But I certainly, yeah, I think because I'd done a degree in drama and I wanted to be a performer at some point, but then I didn't go down the drama school route. I think that, yeah, all those different elements, you know, so it did make me kind of look at where I wanted to go every now and then and what I wanted to do. Yeah, so it has been transitions. I haven't really thought about it in those terms. But yeah, there have been it has been quite an interesting road, actually. I just hadn't thought about it like that.
Not a straight one in a sense, but on the other hand, that gives you much more scenery on the way.
Yeah.
Which makes me, and I'm going to ask a question, I hope you won't mind, and don't answer if you don't want to, but the going to drama school at 30 is a slightly unusual circumstance, not that uncommon, but slightly unusual, but having had the experience beforehand, was that helpful, or did... I suppose what I'm sort of gearing this up is that so many actors go to drama school early on, learn how to do it from drama school, and then go off and do it.
Yeah.
If you've learned a different way of doing it, do they unpick you to rebuild you like they do in the army, or can you capitalise on those earlier things? And one of the byproducts of this could be, not for you, but for some people who haven't been through those different stages, there is a certain snobbery, is there not, in the acting world against... Once again, I wrap these speech marks, legitimate and front of cloth, vaudeville musical variety kind of thing. Yeah,
there is a snobbery, I think, but also still with panto. I think, you know, there are lots of people within theatre who look on it as a sort of low art, or not even an art form, you know, which I take issue with. But yeah, there is snobbery about it, and
they won't be happy till the Harlequinade returns.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, every now and then you know, sometimes that it kind of affects you as an actor, because there are people associate with certain connotations, and often they associate with not being a good actor, and you know, and that's just not the case, you know, and so in a way, I sort of revel now in being and loving and championing something that's unpopular. It's almost like being an underdog in some ways, and I don't mind that anymore, because I know what it takes, and I know what dedication a lot of people put into it, you know. So yeah, going back to your question about drama school, it was a funny one, that, because yes, they do break you down a little bit. That's the nature of it, and it was a 2-year course I did. Initially I was on the 1-year course, and I quickly decided I wanted more of it. So I did hop onto the 2-year course. And it was a curious mix, I suppose, because I thought I had good gut instincts, but I've been doing with the street theatre lots of very big characters, and I wanted to try and do stuff that's maybe more subtle, you know, more legitimate sort of theatre, for want of a better word. In a way, they didn't push me as much as I hoped they did.
Oh.
So in the end, like for our final production, where the agents came, we did When We Are Married, and I played the drunk photographer.
The Priestley play.
Yeah, which...
Oh, yeah, but that's
you know, which I adored, but I had a big moustache on, and nobody saw me. And I think I'd been so often playing older characters, as we did within the street theatre thing, and, you know, Ugly Sister, it's all that big character stuff, that I was hoping to do something a little bit more sort of subtle, and it didn't happen, you know.
One of the middle-aged men, in fact, yes.
Yeah, and it's taken me a long time, in terms of work as well as an actor, to get to a point now where I'm sort of comfortable doing roles that are my age. I struggled with that for a while because it was unusual to me, you know, and so now it's only recently where I feel like the age I am, which is nearly 50, is kind of coincided with the kind of parts I've been given now, and I feel very comfortable with it, you know.
I'm going to flannel you dreadfully, but I am going to say I would not have guessed that. I'm also heading towards 50, and your skin, obviously, theatre's good for you, if I may say.
Oh, it's the injections I have of monkey placenta.
Backlighting.
Yeah.
I can't arrange that in the office where I work most of the time.
When my beard grows out and it's big and grey, then I start to look my age, believe me. Yeah.
So, this is, I hope you won't mind me saying, this is absolutely fascinating. So, you learnt and you got a great deal from the drama course and the drama school, but not quite everything that you were hoping for.
Yeah.
And yet you have those skills now. So what was the next stage of development for you?
Well, like all these things, isn't it? It's doing it.
Yes.
It's doing it, you know, and I've been pretty lucky. I know I've worked fairly regularly as an actor all the way since drama school. Really, I haven't had much of a kind of downtime. And my first job out of drama school was with a company called Northern Broadsides, who do big tours, big companies, 13, 14, 15. With, at the time, they only employed Northern actors and did Shakespeare. There's a guy called Barry Rutter who ran it, who used to be an actor at the National and the RSC. And he got very fed up with never being able to play a king because he didn't do RP, and he's from Hull. And he set up a company. And so it was Northern actors using what he called your voice, your Northern voice, not your accent, because it's where you come from, to do Shakespeare. And it worked brilliantly.
I was going to say, where do people think Richard III was from?
Well, exactly. And there was no RP, and it's all that kind of thing. And they reckon, the accent was more akin to kind of northern tones, and sometimes so the speech patterns and the cadence of the writing. It really works. And again, that was another great training, because they were still like, Barry's a bit like an old-fashioned actor-manager, so he'd direct it and he'd be in it,
Sir.
Yeah, very, kind of like that, really. And he's a character, as you have to be doing that kind of stuff. But the brilliant thing was, he knew his onions about Shakespeare, and we'd go to all kinds of different venues. So we used to play Skipton Cattle Market.
Really?
Then the next week we'd be playing Sheffield Lyceum, and then we'd be in the Round at the New Vic in Stoke-on-Trent, and then we'd be in a barn in Nottingham.
And yet, isn't that wonderful? Because that completely throws away any sense of snobbery. It is something for everyone.
It is something for everyone, and also his at the time the productions were very simple, so it was just not much lighting. It was the actors in a space with the audience, and I learned a great deal from them, actually, and that was a great training. And then I started to get sort of other rep work, and I think it was the second year, the first year out of drama school, I then got panto at. I did Northampton at the Rep. Next door to the Rep is the big theatre, which name I can't remember now, but it's a really big old theatre. And they did it was really weird. They did a commercial panto, and we did our Rep panto.
Oh, did you?
Side by side. But that just showed you what different beasts they were. So the panto next door to us had Anita Dobson in it. It was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and it had all the dwarves in it. And we were doing our kind of rep panto.
That's a fascinating. I mean, obviously you saw the big one.
Yeah,
as well as,
yeah.
I mean, if you are able to remember just some of the atmospheric differences as well, because by which I mean, you say they're very different beasts, and in my head I can imagine and I can see that they're very different beasts. Just comparing, well, forgive me, the Greenwich pantomime every year, and I don't in any way knock Richmond, but I'm going to pick it as a very good example of the more franchisey, the ambassador's circuit, if you like.
Yeah.
I enjoy them both, but I enjoy yours much better, and it has a different atmosphere and it has a different feel. Was that even more writ large in the...
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously being in the other one, you can't quite see it from the outside.
Yes.
But I mean, one anyway. The theatre is beautiful. That little theatre in Northampton, and so the settings and things were just different, and the feeling was different. And they did original music in that panto at Northampton, which I'm not mad about.
No.
But it had a really nice kind of feel, and I suppose that one was more slanting towards kids, actually. But there was enough kind of slapstick and all that to make it so adults could have a good time. But the one next door, which was a very good one, actually, and Anita Dobson was a great Wicked Queen, but it was just big and brash spectacle and loud, massively amped and
in lieu of intimacy, actually.
Yeah, but I think with a big theatre like that, what are you going to do? You kind of have to do that.
And yet, breaking the fourth wall is all about making a connection, and it's so much easier in an intimate environment.
Well, it is. I suppose it is. I see what you're saying. Yeah,
Sorry, I'm a very bad man. I don't make myself plain at all. I'm sorry.
No. I see what you're saying now. But yes, you are trying to make that connection. But I've learnt from those pantos as well, because when you see a good comedian who can do that, and cross that divide into the audience. You know, I've learnt from a few of those. I mean, I'd say bizarrely most of my influence is from TV, weirdly, and variety on TV and those films. But when you see a good comedian do that, I mean, I've seen Ken Dodd loads of times, and I saw him in Panto at Hanley.
Did you?
Yeah, and you know, fantastic. I saw Norman Wisdom do Panto at Hanley as well, and he was the same. You know, he knew how to get to that audience. And when you see a comedian like that, and they have the wherewithal to warm an audience up, to get them on side, you know, it's such a skill that, and it's great to see. And there are still some people, even, you know, modern day comedians who can do that in Panto.
Well, it's funny, isn't it? I think this, in any form of comic theatre, whether it be pantomime or a comic play, the audience, certainly a British audience, I think, needs to be given licence to laugh. I think it can do it on its own, but if there's something early on that allows it to do so, that lets it know that it's okay to put its hair down, then it will enjoy it twice or three times as much. Panto, of course, has the built-in elements of a fairy at the beginning, or whatever it is going to be, or a direct address, which you don't have in a comic play per se. But I do think that a British audience needs, you were talking about being warmed up. It needs to engage in a way that it feels comfortable with.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Bearing in mind we clench ferociously the moment anyone jumps off the stage and says, "I'm looking for someone to come up with me." I know.
Well, you know, me too. I if I'm an audience member, I don't want to know how to run a mile. And actually, that's why here I don't pick somebody up and put them on stage, because I don't want anybody to be really uncomfortable. But I do pick on a man, you know, and do all that.
See you later.
Yeah, exactly. I do all that. So, but yeah, some of those comedians. I'm trying to think of the name of the guy who's been at Bradford Alhambra. I can't. This is terrible of me. 4 years. Billy Pierce.
Oh, now that name sounds familiar. Yes.
So Billy Pierce, you know, he kind of started in the 70s, and he's been doing Panto for a long time. And I think he's done Panto at Bradford Alhambra now for 15 years. And it's really funny. I mean, he makes a joke of it, but he must be a late 50s, probably a bit older into his 60s, and he's still playing the lead rather than the comic.
How interesting.
Yeah, yes. But it's the combined role. But he is superb at, because I always try and go and see that, because it runs much later than a lot of them, and I live not far from there. And usually I'll go on a wet Tuesday night in February, and to watch him take that audience of a Tuesday night and just keep going until he knows they're up to that standard where we've all relaxed is just incredible to watch, and it's something I can't do. I couldn't.
Do you not think so?
No, I couldn't do what he does because I'm not a comedian. You know, I have certain things I can pull out. I have certain ways, but I'm not a comic in that sense. And I think, you know, there's a difference. And going back to what you were saying, you know, the difference between those rep pantos, which the one here at Greenwich is more like that.
Yes, it feels like that.
And the difference between the what I'd call the commercial pantos. You know, I think on the whole, the rep pantos have actors being comic, whereas the commercial ones have actual comics and comedians.
Shipped in, as it were.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the thing for me is it is interesting, and I suffer sometimes. I do get nervous sometimes before I go on, even into the run, because I'm not a comedian.
No.
I'm a comic actor, and there's a difference. And unlike even a lot of actors who are Dame, I kind of assume a character, however loosely, but my voice changes, whereas a lot of actors playing Dame will just do their normal voice. And I think it depends on who you are. I never really have known who I am, which sounds very dramatic and psychological. But I don't really. I don't think I've got necessarily a very strong personality, whereas I know some actors who know exactly who they are and they have that personality, and so they'll just put on the dress and that's who they'll be. I have to assume a character, and not only assume Dame isn't female impersonation.
No, it's not.
You know, and I don't do that, but there is a femininity to it, a comic femininity. But what I also try and do every time I go on it is channel all the comedians I love. So I think, you know, there is a little bit of Arthur Askey, maybe. There's certainly some Eric Morecambe. Sometimes I'll deliberately do it because I wear glasses in the show, and I'll deliberately do it, you know, just to do that. But that's what I have to work myself up into before I go on. And that first 5 minutes where I kind of do what is effectively a kind of stand-up spot, I'm nervous every time I do that, because it's not I have to assume that. So
it's not natural in your blood in that sense. It's,
it's
an assumed character, which makes you an actor. Exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, but then what I do love is the ensemble nature of that, and playing with people who can do it too. And we've been lucky here over the years at a few people who know how to do it. And Paul Krytov, yeah,
and Anthony
Spargo, who's back this year doing Hook. You know, a joy to play with, and that they have funny bones and they know it. And I love writing for them as well, in terms of I can hear Anthony Anthony sort of signed on this year quite early, which was great, and I can just hear him, so I can write to his strengths, you know. So I do like that ensemble nature of these kind of pantos, really. Yeah.
This is absolutely fascinating. I'm just delighted talking about it. You're also talking about the craft. The very first statement I made, actually, as we started talking, was about how the brilliance of the performance and the stage hides genuine craft and genuine skill. And, you know, in an exam you have to show you're working, but in pantomime you mustn't.
Yeah, and I always say when we start to rehearse, it is part of the thing, isn't it, that you've got to look like part of the skill, and even it is artifice sometimes, but you've got to look like you're having the best time ever at every single show. And I believe in that, and that is part of our job, because they're coming to us on a very special time with all the family. You know, they're looking to you to give them that special time, and no matter what, and no matter if it's a small audience, you have to do that, and that's a real artifice. And unlike a musical or a play, which has an internal thing that pushes it along, we're inviting them in a very basic way. We're talking to them, and we're getting them to talk back to us, and you have to keep that going. And unlike a musical, where if you're not getting laughs, you've got all the music to do. If you're not getting laughs, you know, it's tough, but you have to keep going, and hopefully you win them over, you know, eventually. And it's always like that with a small house, you know. They are more reticent, of course, and then they get to know you, and you get to know them. It's like, come on, it's okay. We're in the same room, and we're being stupid. Come along with us. You know?
And that intimacy once again helps. You know, oddly, the advantage of a smaller audience is that you can make that connection more easily.
You can, but again, you know, I defend people like, you know, Ken Dodd, who can do that in the Opera House at Blackpool.
Yes.
You know, and those great comedians can make everybody in that auditorium think, you know, it brings them into him, or he comes to them, you know. But it is easier in a small auditorium for sure. Yeah. But yeah, so that, I think that's part of the artifice, and it's hard work. I mean, today we've run the first half this afternoon, the first half of the panto, and we were exhausted. Part of that is nervous energy because we haven't put it all together, but part of it is it's hard work. And nowadays casts are smaller, so you're working harder, so you're not just coming on for your little, you know, and like a dame, if you're not on, you're changing. Obviously I'm not doing that yet, but these things are hard work. And I always do, the big thing I say when I direct our pantos is, we're on the front foot, we're never on the back foot. No. I hate pantos where you've got the villain leaning on the pros, you know, and we're pushing it forward all the time, and we're leaning out, and we're bringing them in all the time. So that makes it hard work.
But the rewards are stupendous, are they not? The pace, the dynamism, what you're talking about there is that creation of an atmosphere. You know, front foot means active, and active is engaging.
Yeah.
Whereas, as you say, louche and nonchalant,
yeah,
fine in an Old-Camera play.
Yeah.
But he never wrote that panto. I know he was in Peter Pan in 1903 or whatever it was, but it wasn't a panto then, was it?
No. Well, yes, this is an interesting conversation that we can come on to maybe. But yeah, it is about creating that atmosphere. And I take that very seriously. And even with those things I mean, ad-libs are all part of it, and that is partly my job as well. And my licence as the main clown is to bridge that. I'm that conduit between audience, and I can wink at the audience, and I can make other people laugh on stage, as long as the audience know that's what's happening and we're all sharing that together. But I don't like too much of it, because I think, you know, you're at the peril of the whole thing falling apart. And when the actors start mucking about together, I've been in the audience when that's happened, and you do lose that. I think it's good. You have to share everything, but the story as well has got to carry you along, I think, you know.
But that's true of any theatre, isn't it? If the book doesn't work, you can put as much as you like into it, but it won't work.
Yeah.
The book has got to be right.
Yeah.
I mean, forgive me, I'm an aficionado of musicals, and I have seen Act 2 Trouble. We all have seen Act 2 Trouble.
Yeah.
I've recently seen Allegro, the Rodgers and Hammerstein. Fantastic piece in its way, but it's fantastic because it's so marvellously flawed. It's no way of failure, but it is flawed. And that's Act 2 Trouble in the extreme.
Yeah.
Well, I think Act 1's got something to answer for as well, but there we are.
But I think it's very, I think, book, or again, segueing slightly, but book musicals, that's difficult. They're difficult things to do.
Gosh,
I think,
yeah.
you know, it is hard. Yeah, and I think, you know, at least with a panto, you already have the structure, most of the time anyway, that you can kind of pick from that will help you. So there's usually a strong storyline anyway.
Some are harder than others, though, aren't they? Dick Whittington Act 2 is just let's go abroad, kill some rats, come home.
Yes, it is, I suppose.
I always think that was one of the hardest ones to fill the gaps in.
Yeah, Cinderella can be a bit like that as well, because, you know, there's not a great deal of plot in Cinderella.
Yes, from ball to slipper is a...
yeah. But sometimes that can be nice, where you can segue and you can go off on tangents. And I mean, interestingly, this year, which we're doing Peter Pan, although I've written a new story, this is a big experiment actually this year. I am nervous of this year because Peter Pan is its own thing, I think. The play version of Peter Pan, you know, obviously since 1904, and that is its own thing. So, but it's become a panto staple, especially on the bigger companies.
Only the last 10, 15, 20 years, perhaps, though. I mean, I find this fascinating, if I may, because, once again, going back to Victorian, you know, you and I both know the history of pantomime, and you know how the Harlequinade had a transformation sequence into the fairy tale, and then the fairy tale eventually took over from the traditional sort of Italian elements.
Yeah.
Although it's interesting, you used the word clown for Dame, and obviously the heroine is Columbine, and you know Paul Crichton for Spargo will be the old man in some sense.
Exactly.
Or you have a different old man as well, don't you?
Yeah.
Last year.
Yeah.
Can't see Harlequin left, by the way. He seems to have gone completely, I think, if we're talking the archetypes.
Yeah, he does really. Although, I mean, I suppose he could I suppose sometimes you still have the Dame and the comic in the Son or wishy-washy. You know that. Yeah, who's clown and who's Harlequin? That. Yeah, but then
it's disappearing.
It is disappearing actually, because Harlequin sometimes is kind of hero as well, isn't he?
Yes.
Yeah. So
protagonist at least.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose sometimes here we've tended to do away with the kind of silly Billy character, and sometimes made the main character Jack or something a bit comic and a bit of a hero. So that maybe that's a kind of sort of nod to that.
It's a useful fusion, actually. I think, particularly in modern straitened circumstances.
Yeah, exactly. When you can't have many people in the cast. Yeah.
But take us back to the experimental point about Peter Pan. And the fact that in the Victorian era, almost any fairy tale seems to have been able to be used. You look back at the old playbills and whatever, you see Humpty Dumpty, and you say, well, even in my lifetime, I can't remember the last time I saw Babes in the Wood. That's disappeared.
Yeah.
Sinbad appeared in the 1980s for about 10, 15 years and seems to have disappeared again. I rather liked Sinbad. I thought that was a good addition. I
like Sinbad, and I did a version for a theatre up in the north, and I liked it, and I've been trying to persuade James to do it here. He's been slightly reluctant.
Really?
I don't know why. I know Stratford East are doing Sinbad this year, so I'm still going to kind of push away at that, because I think it can be quite good.
I saw David Yip as Sinbad in about 1982, I suspect, yes, when he was still the Chinese detective on British television.
Yeah.
Throwing it back a bit.
Yeah.
But when it seems to me that it's a great pity that actually there were huge numbers, and then through the 20th century it sort of solidified with a medium-sized group of regulars. Puss in Boots and Ali Baba would turn up.
Yeah.
I haven't seen Ali Baba for yonks.
Yeah.
And then it really narrowed down. And then the only two I can think of that are now regularly, well, Sinbad came and sort of went again. And Peter Pan is the most recent one that's come into the world of pantomime.
Yeah.
I think it's a great... I'm marvellous that things are being absorbed.
Yeah.
But great pity that we'll never see a Humpty Dumpty panto again.
No,
No one knows what the plot would be there.
Well, funnily enough, I mean, here at Greenwich, because if you're here long enough, the audience start to trust you, and the titles, up to a point, I think, you can play with the titles and you can be more adventurous because they just trust that they're going to come and see a good show with a good creative team and the way they like to see you do it.
Yes.
If they've liked it, they'll come back. So I think we have been lucky here where we have done more titles than maybe a lot of places.
Well, you've done 10 years. This is your 11th year, isn't it? Here,
it's 11th I've been in. It's 12th I've written. Yeah.
And I don't think you've repeated yet, or have you won?
No, we have repeated a couple of times. So we've done. What did we do? I'm trying to think now.
Throwing a kettle drum down the staircase.
Sorry, yeah, something's happening out there, isn't it? We've done Jack and the Beanstalk twice now. Have we done Aladdin twice? Yes. So Aladdin was the very first one that I wrote here, but I wasn't. That was all my involvement, and then we did it once I'd started doing them. So that's been done twice as well. But yeah, not many repeats, and hence actually. So Peter Pan was my. I'd thought about that. James had often said he'd like to do Peter Pan if I didn't do it one year, if I didn't do Panto one year, because there isn't a day minute. Sometimes there is.
I want to talk about that, but yes.
Yeah. But, so I was asked to write a Panto for a charity thing a couple of years back, and every 2 years there's a group of interior designers in London, and they do a big charity Panto, and they book a West End theatre, and they do it free for a week, and it's like just a very big amateur panto on a grand scale, and they spend no amount of money on it, and they get designers like Galliano and to do all the costumes. So they're
sumptuous to look at.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. And that year it was NSPCC, it was the charity that they were doing it for, and they wanted to do Peter Pan. So I wrote this kind of version of Peter Pan, and it really worked. I really sort of liked it, and there's a couple of people who I trust who came to see it, who were kind of in the business of it, and they really liked it. And there'd been a couple of Peter Pans I'd seen panto-wise that I didn't think quite worked because they fell between two stools, and it was kind of a lot of the play version with panto in, and it didn't quite work for me. So anyway, I said to James, look, can we try this? And he's been brilliant, and he said, yeah. I mean, Peter Pan's a good seller anyway, a good title. So I've written a new story, and I am nervous about it. And there's been more kind of script changes than usual while we've been rehearsing, just trying to kind of get it right. So it's all the characters, or a lot of the characters you might love, with a different, just a different story.
Can I, however, just say that I'm actually delighted to hear that, because can I not say that?
No, I'm just wondering. I'm intrigued as to why you're saying that.
Well, I'll be absolutely honest with you. I enjoy the concept of Peter Pan very much more than I enjoy the story of Peter Pan, because actually, bless him, J.M. Barrie is a great writer. I'm not going to... The Admiral Crichton is a marvellous piece.
Which I've done. I played Admiral Crichton at the New Vic in Stoke, a few years back.
Were you Crichton?
Yeah.
I can see you doing that awfully well.
Well, thank you very much.
And only this last weekend I saw a well-remembered voice, which is one of his 1918 play about World War I loss.
Oh wow, I don't know that one.
It's not been performed in London for something like 100 years.
Right.
So, I was very pleased to see it. It was very, very atmospheric and excellent, and it addresses the issue of seances and connection with the supernatural, which is presumably one of the reasons it was popular at the time and less popular since.
Yeah.
But it addresses, or it investigates, the reality or otherwise of seances through a ghost, interestingly. And the ghost debunks or doesn't debunk seances. That was interesting, using the supernatural to investigate the supernatural, if you like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I digress, I do. But Peter Pan is a little bit by numbers. You had the nursery scene where, bless, you had the I can't find my shadow, and can I put it on with soap, and what is a kiss, and Mr. Darling can't do his tie, and I can give you all this because I've seen it a million times.
Yeah.
And people almost revere the text too much because it is an author text, whereas Jack and the Beanstalk, as you know, is 1812 or something in its first recorded version, and it goes back well beyond that. So fairy tales are fair game. You can tweak and twiddle and work and warp and weft and whatever it is.
Yeah.
Whereas Peter Pan is a little bit Edwardian still, and I have a lot of time for that, but I don't always want to see the same thing. And it suffers from not having a dame, in my view. I've never seen a version of it with a dame. I know there have been versions of it with a dame, but they are quite rare. I was lucky enough to see Simon Callow playing Captain Hook.
Wow.
So that was, and I had the privilege of speaking to him beforehand. And
Right.
he was talking about watching Sir Donald Warfit do it. And I thought, I'm enjoying this conversation. It was taking a turn I wasn't expecting. So there was lots to commend, and it was beautiful. But this, and then you know the leaving the poison out.
Yeah.
I appreciate there are some things that are going to have to remain in it, Tinkerbell, etc. Blah blah blah. I
Yeah.
assume,
Yeah.
and I don't in any way knock the Barry. But as I say, I think the problem is the text is almost too revered, and therefore people are too afraid to move very far from it, and therefore you see the same show line for line almost. You know, appreciate the copyright aspects and the Great Ormond Street and the perpetual copyright and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But the idea that you can have fun with it. You've been talking about playing with other performers, playing with the audience. I want people to play with the text. And
Yeah.
I'm hoping that's, to a degree, what you've done.
Yeah, I mean, very much so. I mean, I've just basically taken the characters and done a different thing. So one of the main differences, I suppose, and actually, so it is a weird one this year because we start in modern day.
Oh, now.
Which panto-wise is
doesn't happen.
it doesn't happen.
They're in their own world, aren't they? But they're always faintly medieval. with
Yeah,
kings and
exactly.
barons.
Yeah. So, I don't know. Some people might not consider this as a panto, but then some people don't consider Peter Pan anyway as a panto. So it is a bit of a departure, actually. But you've got to try these things, and it's great that Greenwich will let us do that. But what that enables you to do is to kind of twist it a little bit, and also that element of the thing. Sometimes I don't know what I think. Maybe it's just because brains we know what panto is, and so like you were saying that kind of medieval look with modern day references and all that still seems to work. But for me, that Victorian with modern day references of panto and starting in the Edwardian bedroom, it just never sits quite well. So now I've just kind of gone, well, that's not what's happening. Hook, I don't want to give it away too much, but anyway, Hook is back. He's back by a weird little machination, and so it means that he can enjoy the things that modern day is provided for him a little bit, and he can be a bit more kind of into a pop number or something because he's experienced modern day, and so we've just done we've kind of played with that. And I think there is an irreverence to it, actually. We are kind of going, look, this is Peter Pan, but we're just pulling it apart. So I hope people will see it in the same spirit. Some people
Peter
might...
Pandemonium.
Yeah, well, it is a bit, yeah. So I hope people will... I'm sure, I'm hoping they'll like it, but I have been a bit nervous and plot-wise, I just kind of hope it kind of works. But it's the same aesthetic as we've sort of built up here. It's the same team. So I think there's a lot of similarities.
Musical talk. Well, there we are. That was Andrew Pollard, and we leave him for just 1 week because we'll be hearing the second part of that fascinating conversation in next week's episode. But, as you will have picked up, Andrew is appearing in this year's Greenwich Theatre pantomime, which is called Peter Pan, A New Adventure. And as usual, he is the writer, and he's also playing the pantomime dame, as you heard, cleverly finding a way of including a dame in the story which so often doesn't have one. Although, as I've said before, it's one I think needs a panto dame. If you would like to go and see the show, you can. It's on now. It opened on the 18th of November and it's going all the way to the 8th of January 2017, which is a Sunday. The Greenwich Theatre is a wonderful venue and very easy to reach. There are 2 Docklands-like railway stations right close by. One is Greenwich, one is Cutty Sark, and I strongly recommend you seriously think about attending if you can. The website, www.greenwichtheatre.org. And rest assured, I shall be going myself. Well, that's it for this week. I'm about to transform now into Harlequin, or possibly more accurately Old Man, Pantaloon these days, and then I'll spend a week having zany adventures on my own, involving chases and clowns, obviously, until we meet again next time. So until then, there's just time for me to say, in the traditional way, those words of closing. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk edited and presented by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2016. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our brand new website, musicaltalkpodcast.weebly.com, or subscribe to us on iTunes, and follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at musicaltalkthos. So taking us back to you, I don't feel sorry. I enjoyed very much the scenery, by the way, on our little walk.
Oh yes, I'm happy to meander. Yeah.
And I will just ask, you are happy with the meander? You're fine, thank you. I do like the byways.
No, I love it. No, it's not. Sometimes it's not many people you can chat to about these things. People don't.
I think that may be true.
Yeah.